Politics, international affairs, and many more all sum up in this show. This is Flash News. I'm Karolina Pańczkowska. Welcome. We begin Flash News with the highest daily number of new coronavirus infections in Poland. Since the start of the pandemic, that's more than 35,000 cases, more than 400 people have died. According to the Polish Prime Minister, this is a critical moment and call for strict adherence to the restrictions. New ones will take effect across the country starting tomorrow.
Vaccines are still the most effective way to fight the pandemic. So far, more than 5.5 million vaccinations have been performed in Poland. More than 3.5 million people have received the first dose and nearly 2 million have received 2 doses. We are in the midst of a very critical battle with COVID-19 today, a phase that we can overcome primarily through vaccines. About 7 million or maybe even a little bit more than 7 million vaccines will arrive in the next 5 weeks. In the morning, another shipment of AstraZeneca vaccines arrived in Poland, over 70,000 doses. Due to the increasing number of infections, the situation in hospitals is worsening. Therefore, more field facilities are being opened. The epidemic is unfortunately raging in our country and we are getting new patients every day. That is unfortunately over 500 more beds occupied by coronavirus patients every day. The most difficult situation is in Mazovia, Silesia and Greater Poland. Every week we have an increase of 1/4 of the cases that we recorded. Until that dynamic drops, there is no discussion at all about loosening restrictions. Therefore, services will be scrupulous in enforcing epidemic restrictions. The actions of state services against people who break out of social solidarity, who lack imagination and responsibility for others, will be very firm. Starting tomorrow, new restrictions will take effect across the country. Among others, nurseries and kindergartens, hairdressing salons, beauty and cosmetic salons will be closed. The activity of large construction stores will also be suspended. The number of worshippers in the church will also be limited. The tightened restrictions will remain in effect until the 9th of April.
Not only Poland, so worth to mention that the number of new infections is growing rapidly across Europe. More and more countries are deciding to maintain or introduce stricter restrictions. In Lithuania, people can only leave their homes with legitimate reasons. The Finnish government, though, on the other hand, intends to introduce an order to stay at home in 5 regions of the country.
A ban on inter-regional travel, a ban on visitors, restrictions in restaurants. These are just some of the restrictions that have taken effect in Spain as of today. The French authorities have decided to implement a lockdown in 3 more departments. The epidemic is gaining momentum. A lockdown will be introduced in the departments of Nivier, Rhône and Aube. So far, a strict lockdown has been in place in 16 of France's 101 departments, including Paris. But the number of new infections continues to rise, and last night was the highest in 4 months. The scale of the problem is particularly evident in hospitals. The situation is becoming extremely worrying. The 3rd wave of the pandemic has hit our country with tremendous force, especially in the Ile-de-France region. We can see this by the number of hospital admissions. In this facility, the alarming threshold of 100 daily admissions of patients with COVID-19 was exceeded yesterday. The strict lockdown will also be reinstated in Belgium. Hairdressers and beauty salons will be closed from Saturday until the 25th of April. Kindergartens will remain open, but schools and universities will switch entirely to remote teaching. Work is also to be done remotely where possible. For the past 17 weeks, we have managed to work together to prevent the arrival of the 3rd wave of the coronavirus pandemic. We stuck to the restrictions even though it took a lot of effort on our part. I'm confident that we will break this wave as well as we succeeded with the previous one. Disturbing information is also coming from across Poland's eastern border. Last night, the highest number of new infections since the beginning of the pandemic was reported in Ukraine. About 18,000 people tested positive, including almost 1,000 children. In the past week, there has been a dramatic increase in the number of patients with severe COVID-19. They require hospitalization, oxygen and intensive care. The situation is bad all over the country and our hospital is no exception. A vaccination campaign has been underway in Ukraine for over a month, but so far the vaccine was administered to only 170,000 people.
We look east as the American State Department and the head of European diplomacy have called for the immediate release of the Polish minority activists, the activists of the Union of Poles detained in Belarus. Yesterday, were taken into custody in the capital, Minsk. Earlier, the head of the union, Angelika Borys, was detained also.
Light for Belarus in the colors of the historic white, red, white flag unrecognized by the Lukashenko regime. However, yesterday this light also had the face of two Polish activists arrested by the regime, Andrzejka Borys and Andrzej Poczobut. We have 300 political prisoners. We have a large number of trials of the opposition every day. Once the majority is behind bars or about to be, you have to look for an external enemy. And Alexander Lukashenko found this enemy, Poles. The head of the Union of Poles in Belarus was detained on Tuesday. Yesterday, other people were detained, including Andrzej Poczobut. People of Polish origin in Belarus are even accused of activities propagating Nazism, which is exactly what the Soviet propaganda or Stalinist propaganda in particular used. The US State Department and the head of the European diplomacy, Josep Borrell, have called for the immediate release of the Polish minority activists. President Andrzej Duda also sent a letter to US leader Joe Biden as the country's president currently presiding over the UN Security Council, in which he appeals to raise the issue of Poles in Belarus at the council. I am asking you to raise this very issue at the Security Council. We also agreed that I will additionally write a letter to the UNSC on this issue. The president also met with representatives of the Belarusian minority in Poland. The atmosphere of this meeting shows that there are no negative emotions between Poles and Belarusians, that we are part of one community. The repressions against Poles in Belarus were also discussed by Polish and Lithuanian parliamentarians during a remote session of the Parliamentary Assembly of Poland and Lithuania. In the afternoon, more bad news came from behind Lukashenko's curtain. Paweł Majejka, a journalist and a host of Belsat TV channel, was arrested in Grodno on charges of praising fascism. Meanwhile, the UN Human Rights Council has just set up an investigative group to gather evidence of violence against Belarusians who have been protesting since last August.
At least 32 people were killed and more than 160 injured in a train crash in Egypt. Two passenger trains being on the same track collide because someone from the first train used the emergency brake.
This is a photo of the rescue operation taken inside the crushed train cars. The reaction of the authorities was swift. The Egyptian president ordered the prime minister and ministers to go to the crash site. At the same time, the prosecution launched an investigation. It was initially determined that the first train stopped because someone pulled the emergency brake. After a while, the second train hit the stationary train from behind. The country's president announced that those responsible for the tragedy would be held accountable. Australia is starting a big cleanup after the worst floods in 50 years. Today, Australian authorities revoked more than a dozen evacuation warnings. At the peak of the floods, they affected 85,000 people. New South Wales is the region most affected by the floods. In this most populous state of more than 8 million people, water flooded the same areas that were hit by bushfires a year ago. 5 days of non-stop rain cut off the entire state from the rest of the continent. Homes and even farms were washed away by the water. One of the most important European directors, Bertrand Tavernier, died in Saint-Maxime, France. He left behind more than 30 films, including such famous ones as Death Watch, The Judge and the Murderer, and Around Midnight, which won the Oscar for Best Music in 1987. Bertrand Tavernier was 79 years old.
And we're back to North Africa. An operation to unblock the Suez Canal is underway after a giant container ship ran aground, halting the traffic on the most important waterway linking Asia to Europe. More than 150 oil tankers are stranded in the traffic jam, the gigantic traffic jam for the time being.
This is one of the largest container ships in the world. Its length, 400 meters, is more than the Eiffel Tower measures and slightly less than the towers in Kuala Lumpur. It transports 20,000 containers at once. It got stuck in the Suez Canal on Tuesday.
There might be a failure some way with the rudder, with the propeller even. There might be a lull in wind or an increase in wind.
The container ship turned around and caused the world's biggest sea jam.
That's part of the reason why people use the Suez Canal, because it's quicker and cheaper.
Dug 150 years ago, the Suez Channel is the shortest waterway between the east and the west. The cost of crossing is about €700,000, but in less than a dozen hours. The circumnavigation of Africa is 20,000 kilometers and even 2 weeks of sailing.
Container ships, tankers are not delivering food, fuel, manufactured goods to Europe.
And this is already affecting production and availability of goods on both continents. That's why attempts are being undertaken night and day to free the unit.
Yeah, we are basically offloading the weight of the vessel in order to get it refloated.
The problem is that it is impossible to bring heavy equipment, including cranes and overhead cranes, to the desert shore at short notice to unload the container ship, and the whole operation may take days or even weeks.
There are road maps, political maps, or topographic maps, and now also a genomic map will be created. This database of DNA of Poles will help in scientific research and preparation of modern medicines. Poznań Consortium of Universities and a research center received money for this amazing project.
Scientists will examine 5,000 Poles and representatives of ethnic minorities living in our country. They will check what genetic material has been passed from father to son for centuries. We are able to compare which population were most similar to how the gene migration may have occurred. The project focuses on uncovering the history of our ancestors, but not only. It also aims to show the differences between populations from different regions. Some of the samples will also be tested for human features. If we were to study athletes, well, these are the traits that this athlete has, which is this performance, this is how he jumps in the distance, or this is how he plays ball, and this is the kind of genome he has. The National Center for Research and Development has granted 100 million Polish zloty for the creation of the genetic map of Poland.
And as every night, we treat you with some art. The art of the Polish painter Jacek Malczewski is still very popular. His painting has been sold for over 6,700,000 zlotys. And this is an absolute record when it comes to this artist.
The spinner was created almost 100 years ago. It came straight from the artist's studio to a certain family, and no one ever heard of it ever again. Until now, it has not been known on the art market. One has to admit that it entered it with a hit. The masterpiece was sold for nearly 7 million zlotys. At the moment, it is the most expensive painting by Jacek Malczewski sold on the Polish market. The fashion for Malczewski has been around forever. Unfortunately, many of our great artists' paintings were lost during World War II. Last year, the first of them, at the piano, returned to the National Museum. We were able to locate the object through collaboration with Polish museum professionals in the UK. It was being prepared for auction. The most expensive Polish painting is the one by Tamara Lempicka. A year ago in London, it was sold for over 82 million zlotys. The highest bid in the history of Polish auctions was for Wojciech Fangor's M22, 7,316,000 zlotys. In his entire oeuvre, he created only 3 rosettes, which are these blurred circles that are supposed to act on the viewer, and that's why it is so special. That record was also set last year.
This is Flash News, and still more to come. African elephants threatened with extinction. The just released latest version of the Red List of Threatened Species leaves no doubts about the future of this largest land animals.
Africa is home to 2 species of elephants, the forest elephant and the savanna elephant. The former is critically endangered with extinction. Its population has declined dramatically in recent decades, even by 86%. Savanna elephants have declined by 60% over the same period, which is supposed to indicate that they are somewhat less endangered. Regardless of the species, however, the cause of the dire situation is one: poaching, because the illegal ivory trade is thriving and not in danger of extinction. A forgotten painting by Vincent van Gogh was sold at an auction in Paris for €13,100,000, much more than expected. The old painting, street scene in Montmartre for more than 100 years, was in the hands of one family, so few people had a chance to see it. The canvas was painted in 1887 when Van Gogh lived in Paris with his brother Theo. Chinese emperors used this seal themselves. Now ordinary people may have such a chance, provided that they can afford to buy seals from the Ming and Qing dynasties. The most valuable of the 3 presented at the auction house in Hong Kong is made of white jade. It was created in the 18th century for Emperor Qianlong. The starting price in the 21st century is $16 million. One plays the trumpet, another dances, and another lifts weights. Cats are lined up at the Champs-Élysées in Paris. There are 20 of them, and they are absolutely unique because each is a work of art. Made of bronze, sculptures are copies of cartoon creature heroes of Belgian artist Philippe Galluc. His comic series about cats is breaking records of popularity. The sculpted version is meant to put passers-by walking in the center of Paris in a good mood.
And that's everything that we've prepared for you. Thank you very much for your attention. Stay tuned for more news from tvp.info and Flash News tomorrow, same time, same tvp.info. Goodbye.